For months, Ukraine has been engaged in intense fighting in the Kursk region, where it successfully reclaimed 1,165 square kilometers in August 2024. However, Russia has regained 40% of this territory through a counteroffensive involving 50,000 soldiers, including up to 12,000 North Koreans sent by Kim Jong-un. Putin had hoped these foreign reinforcements would tip the scales in his favor, but they have now become part of the problem. Ukraine is no longer confined to a defensive stance. President Volodymyr Zelensky has launched a bold new counteroffensive, shifting momentum against Putin's forces. With surprise attacks on multiple fronts, Ukrainian troops are no longer merely holding their positions, they are advancing to reclaim lost territories. But what are the implications for Kursk, for Putin, and for the North Koreans sent to the front? Let's dive into the details, starting with recent developments. On January 6th, CNN reported that Ukraine had launched numerous counteroffensive attacks on Russian positions in Kursk the previous day. This was confirmed by Andriy Kovalenko, head of the Ukrainian Center for Combating Disinformation, who stated that Ukraine was carrying out surprise assaults across the border region. As in the first Ukrainian offensive in August 2024, the plan relied on the element of surprise to disorient Russian forces and force them to retreat. Ukraine's strategy may be paying off. In a brief but significant message posted on Telegram on January 5th, Andriy Yermak, head of Ukraine's presidential office, stated, "Kursk region. Good news. Russia is getting what it deserves." Although he provided no details, his comments suggest Ukraine has achieved at least some success in this counteroffensive and intends to build on this momentum. Meanwhile, the Russian Ministry of Defense presented a completely opposite narrative. While Yermak praised Ukrainian soldiers' courage and alleged success, Russia claimed to have repelled the attacks. In a statement, the Russian ministry said it had taken decisive measures with artillery and air support. According to Moscow, these actions destroyed key Ukrainian forces gathered in the village of Berdyn, located just 9 miles from the Ukrainian border, where they were preparing for the counteroffensive. The ministry claimed it had prevented the armed forces of Ukraine from breaking through, suggesting that Yermak's telegram statements were unfounded. Who is telling the truth? At this point, it's hard to say. CNN reported that it could not independently verify the reports regarding Ukraine's new counteroffensive. However, additional insights might emerge from certain Russian blogs sharing information on the subject. According to CNN, several of these blogs confirmed the existence of fighting on January 5th, stating that Ukrainian forces were advancing north toward Berdyn. One blog claimed that Ukraine had engaged reserves for this counteroffensive and described a clever strategy employed by Ukrainian forces. To break through, the UAF, Ukrainian Armed Forces, deployed radio-electronic warfare devices, disrupting the operation of Russian drones. The blog added that, while Russian tanks and artillery were actively engaging the enemy, most of the fighting was occurring with small arms. Another Russian blog reported that the fighting had begun from the direction of Sudzha and that Ukraine had parachuted troops into the region to reinforce its ground forces. In this offensive, the enemy is using mine-clearing plows, tanks, and other armored vehicles, claimed the blogger. Thus, the only certainty is that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is indeed underway. The use of the term breakthrough by the Russian blogger even suggests that Ukraine may be achieving a far greater success than the Russian Ministry of Defense is willing to admit. Other sources add to this analysis. The Guardian, in a report on Ukraine's attacks, released images showing armored columns advancing through snowy fields toward the village of Bolshu Soldatskoye. Located northeast of Sudzha, this village appears to be a secondary target for the Ukrainian army, suggesting the counteroffensive is unfolding on multiple fronts. This hypothesis is nearly confirmed by Ukraine's general staff, which reported 42 clashes on January 5th, with 12 continuing into the following day. The Guardian also mentions unverified rumors that Ukrainian soldiers have already entered Berdyn and are advancing toward another village called Novosotnitsky. Moreover, it confirms that Ukraine has used electronic countermeasures to neutralize Russian drones and deployed demining units in the Kursk region to clear Russian mines. These reports conflict with the Russian Ministry of Defense's claims that it repelled the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Ukraine continues to exert pressure. In the Kursk region, the Russians are very worried, said Andriy Kovalenko on January 5th. They've been attacked on multiple fronts, which completely surprised them. This suggests that Ukraine's actions extend far beyond a single assault near Berdyan, as Russia claims. Ukraine is launching offensives in dozens of locations, with ongoing fighting in multiple areas and possibly territorial gains elsewhere. It also appears that British-made weapons are being used in this counteroffensive. The Telegraph reports that several Russian military bloggers describe intense and, at times, chaotic battles. Among the Ukrainian armored columns, these bloggers mention the possible presence of British Challenger 2 tanks. While the Telegraph could not confirm this information, if true, it means Russia is now facing cutting-edge equipment. The Challenger 2 is an iconic tank of the British Army, used in conflicts such as Kosovo, Iraq, and Bosnia. First built in 1986, this four-person combat vehicle is among the most advanced equipment on the Ukrainian battlefield. It is equipped with a 120mm L30A-1 rifled main gun capable of carrying 47 shells, as well as a 7.62mm L94A-1 chain gun capable of firing at high rates. Despite its 62.5-ton weight, more with a full crew, this behemoth can reach an impressive speed of 36.6 miles per hour. If these tanks are indeed deployed in the Kursk region, it clearly shows that Ukraine is determined to reclaim some of the territory lost to the Russian counteroffensive. The obvious question is, why did Ukraine choose this moment to launch a counteroffensive? The answer lies partly in the weather conditions of the Kursk Oblast. A harsh winter complicates the movement of Russian ground forces while providing more favorable conditions for Ukrainian armored units, as explained by The Guardian. Besides the Challenger 2 tanks mentioned by the Telegraph, reports also suggest that Ukraine is using Bradley fighting vehicles, allowing it to quickly transport troops to strategic positions. In contrast, Russia relies primarily on its infantry and North Korean troops, who are sent to the front lines on foot. This gives Ukraine a clear advantage in mobility. The timing is also tied to the vulnerability of Russian forces, slowed down by snow and ice, making them less responsive to Ukrainian assaults. Another key factor in Ukraine's decision to counterattack now is the high rate of Russian losses in Kursk. As previously mentioned, Russia has been using a tactic of sending its soldiers, often on foot, against fortified Ukrainian positions. This approach, which Putin has relied on since the start of his Kursk counteroffensive, involves successive waves of human assaults, hoping to deplete enemy resources. It's a brutal and costly tactic, but the winter and Ukraine's superior mobility make it even less effective. Predictably, these assaults have had their intended effect. According to Ukraine, during the 5 months between its initial invasion of Kursk and the current counteroffensive, it inflicted 38,000 casualties on Russian forces. Among these, 15,000 Russian soldiers were reportedly killed in action, and another 23,000 were wounded. True to its habit of exaggeration, Russia claims higher figures, asserting it caused 49,010 Ukrainian losses in Kursk over the same period. However, Moscow does not detail the breakdown between deaths and injuries, and this figure seems inflated, especially considering Russia's efforts to downplay Ukraine's presence in the region. The troops sent by Kim Jong-un as part of a collective defense treaty with Russia are also suffering significant losses. Up to 12,000 North Korean soldiers, including some from the elite Storm Corps, were deployed in October 2024. During a January 2025 appearance on Lex Friedman's podcast, Zelensky confirmed this figure and stated that 3,800 of these soldiers had been killed or wounded by Ukraine, about a third of the contingent sent. Zelensky also claimed that Ukraine annihilated a battalion almost entirely composed of North Koreans in the 2 days leading up to January 4th, evidence of the rapid and significant losses inflicted on Kim's forces. Why are these losses significant in the context of Ukraine's counteroffensive in Kursk? The answer lies in the attrition of Russian forces. Ukraine has gradually weakened the 50,000-strong group deployed by Putin to reclaim the territory. With determined defense, it has reduced the pressure exerted by the Russians. The dwindling number of available troops is weakening Russian lines, creating gaps or less densely defended areas that Ukraine seems to be exploiting. By targeting these weak points, identified through its analysis of Russian losses, Ukraine strikes where it hurts the most. The human wave tactic Putin relied on to break Ukrainian defenses now seems to have had the opposite effect, weakening his own forces. This has allowed Ukraine to reclaim several small villages and towns it lost during Russia's initial advance in Kursk. However, this operation is not just about retaking territory. Ukraine is also keeping an eye on a major event scheduled for mid-January, Donald Trump's inauguration as President of the United States. Zelensky mentioned this during his conversation with Lex Fridman, emphasizing that the security guarantees promised by Trump could end the war in Ukraine if Trump delivers on his commitments. Zelensky also hinted that Trump might have some influence over Putin, enough at least to impose a ceasefire on the Russian leader's special military operation. Trump, for his part, has stated that he would end the war within days of his inauguration, relying on a vague peace plan touted as his main asset. Zelensky does not ignore these statements. He told Friedman, "Trump and I will reach an agreement and propose strong security guarantees with Europe, and then we can talk to the Russians." It remains to be seen whether the Ukrainian president genuinely believes in this scenario. After all, Zelensky told French President Emmanuel Macron on December 30th that Ukraine must be realistic about its territorial challenges and that there is no quick and easy solution to the war. The phrase territorial challenges is critical here, as it directly relates to Ukraine's recent counteroffensive. Ukraine appears intent on strengthening its position on the ground before any potential agreement, demonstrating its determination to defend its interests despite the uncertainties surrounding the future role of the United States. Speculation abounds about the actual content of Trump's plan. One popular theory involves creating a large demilitarized zone along the 1,200-kilometer front line in Ukraine. This zone would be monitored by European forces. Polish, German, British, and French contingents are often mentioned, while the United States would take a more distant role. In this scenario, Ukraine and Russia would be required to accept the terms of a ceasefire, with this zone serving as a buffer to prevent any further offensives. From there, negotiations could begin, primarily focused on dividing the occupied territories. Currently, Russia controls about 1/5 of Ukrainian territory, mainly in the southern and eastern regions. Putin's advance in Donetsk, a topic we'll cover later, could allow him to capture even more territory before Trump's inauguration. Meanwhile, Ukraine is using Kursk as a strategic lever to regain territory occupied by Russia during its special military operation. This highlights another key objective of Ukraine's counteroffensive in Kursk. Despite the massive losses Putin has suffered to reclaim this region, he has achieved some successes. As mentioned earlier, Russia has regained about 40% of the territories it lost during Ukraine's August 2024 invasion. By launching an offensive, Ukraine aims to reclaim some of this lost land to bolster its position if and when Trump manages to bring both sides to the negotiating table. Kursk is not just a battlefield, it's also a strategic card in future discussions. Kursk holds immense strategic and symbolic significance for Putin. Although this region is modest compared to the entirety of the territories Russia has taken from Ukraine, it remains a pivotal point. It's the first time Russia has been successfully invaded since World War II. Losing Kursk to Ukraine, even in exchange for major concessions on other occupied territories, would be a huge humiliation for Putin. This prospect could push the Russian leader to cede more Ukrainian land just to avoid losing Kursk. Zelensky seems well aware of this, and it's likely one reason why Ukraine is ramping up its efforts to regain ground in this region, increasing the pressure on Putin. Another factor explains why Ukraine chose this moment to launch its counteroffensive. Robert Clark, an expert at the Yorktown Institute, believes Ukraine plans to use any territory reclaimed in Kursk as bargaining chips in future negotiations. However, he also notes that Putin has staked his domestic credibility on controlling Kursk. The success or failure of Russia's efforts in this region will profoundly affect how Putin is perceived by his own people. Clark states that this battle is far more significant for Putin than for Trump in the context of upcoming peace talks. During the Christmas holidays, Putin promised his citizens that he would bring the Kursk region back under Russian control. Therefore, Putin's ability to actually maintain Kursk under his grip will be far more crucial for him and Russia than for President Trump in the future, Clark concludes. Once again, the element of humiliation plays a central role. Putin faces increasing pressure, not only from the Russian public, but also possibly from influential factions in the Kremlin. Losing Kursk is seen as a sign of weakness, exacerbated by Ukrainian advances. Reclaiming the region becomes a significant challenge for Russia, especially if Ukraine simultaneously manages to defend its positions and recapture territory. Alex Cadier, an international correspondent for Times Radio, shares this analysis. He points out that Ukraine's counteroffensive challenges the dominant narrative of recent months, where Russia seemed to be gradually regaining ground in Kursk. This shift increases pressure on Putin, showing that even with a numerical advantage thanks to North Korean troops, Ukrainian forces retain their ability to fight back. These Ukrainian counterattacks, particularly intense, have major implications. According to Cadier, they are significant in terms of resources mobilized, but they also risk having diplomatic consequences if ceasefire negotiations are on the horizon. This dynamic places Putin in an increasingly uncomfortable position, where every military setback complicates his efforts to maintain authority and control. For now, the situation seems favorable to Ukraine. Winter conditions have given it the mobility advantage needed to launch its counteroffensive. The heavy losses inflicted on Russian and North Korean forces have created gaps that Ukraine is exploiting successfully. Moreover, with Donald Trump's imminent arrival in the presidency, Ukraine is working to maximize its territorial gains and increase the pressure on a weakened Putin, both domestically and in anticipation of future peace negotiations. However, the situation in eastern Ukraine remains concerning, particularly in Donetsk. While fighting rages in Kursk, Russia continues to make rapid progress in this region, recording its most significant territorial gains since the initial invasion in February 2022. Putin's forces are close to encircling Pokrovsk, a key city in the Donetsk region, and have already forced the Ukrainians to abandon strategic positions, including an underground stronghold in a ruined power plant that had been defended for much of the war. Zelensky cannot ignore these Russian advances. Some observers are criticizing Ukraine's strategy in Kursk, arguing that it would be wiser to redeploy forces from this region to Donetsk to slow Russia's advance. However, Oleksandr Syrsky, commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army, disagrees. He believes that the operation in Kursk has already forced Russia to redirect troops that would otherwise have been sent to Donetsk. By continuing its counteroffensive in Kursk, Ukraine hopes to keep these Russian forces engaged on this front, and possibly even force Moscow to deploy more troops, while reducing its own losses in Donetsk and reclaiming strategic territories in the Kursk region. This strategy, while risky, reflects a calculated gamble to divide the opposing forces. The question now is simple. Will Ukraine's counteroffensive in Kursk succeed? It's too early to say, as the operation is still ongoing. However, Ukraine has experienced failed counteroffensives during Putin's special military operation. In the summer of 2023, it attempted a counteroffensive in southern and eastern Ukraine to reclaim territories taken during the initial invasion. That effort stalled, and Ukraine failed to cut the link between Crimea, controlled by Russia, and the rest of mainland Ukraine. Could the current counteroffensive in Kursk meet the same fate? It's possible, but the context is quite different. During the summer of 2023, Ukraine spent several months preparing the forces and arsenal needed for its counteroffensive. This gave Russia plenty of time to prepare, allowing its troops to set up layered defenses along the front line. Trenches and mines were strategically positioned, significantly slowing Ukraine's attack and enabling Russia to defend most of its captured territory. The situation in Kursk today is very different from that of previous offensives. This time, Ukraine has opted for surprise attacks. While it continues to target several points along the front line, as it did in the summer of 2023, it is not giving Russian forces time to prepare. Moreover, these attacks are taking place while Russia is itself on the offensive, neutralizing the defensive advantage that allowed Putin's forces to repel Ukraine's 2023 summer counteroffensive. It's also possible that this offensive in Kursk is a diversion. According to the BBC, some Russian military bloggers like Yuri Podolyaka suggest that Ukraine's current attacks aim to distract Russia before a larger operation. Alexander Kotz, another Russian blogger, shares this view, claiming that a major offensive could be launched elsewhere while Moscow focuses on these smaller-scale attacks. Perhaps Ukraine is preparing a larger-scale operation against Russia. In that case, Russian statements claiming to have partially contained the Ukrainian counteroffensive would take on a new dimension. It's possible that Russia was meant to neutralize these smaller-scale attacks. Ukraine may thus be teasing the bear, inflicting losses along the way, while preparing a larger assault against a Russia increasingly weakened in Kursk. Many questions remain unanswered. For now, we'd love to hear your opinions on Ukraine's counteroffensive in Kursk. Is this Ukraine's last effort to defend its land before Trump takes office? Is Ukraine preparing a larger-scale attack? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching this video.